Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Professor Julie Kogan, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the College of Business and Law and Vice President of RMIT University. And I'll be your MC for today. So the Honorary Don Farrell, Minister for Trade and Tourism, the Honorary Craig Emerson, Director of the APEC Study Centre, the Honorary Tim Ayres, Assistant Minister for Trade, members of the Diplomatic and Consulate Corps. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Before we begin, it's my pleasure to acknowledge on behalf of everyone here, the traditional owners of the land on which we gather. I pay my respects to elders and to leaders past, present of the Kulin Nation. Our learners, teachers and partners of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent come from the most enduring, continuous culture in the world and an equally long tradition of sharing knowledge and lifeways from which we can learn. So I hope that you enjoyed that lovely light show, which was created by our students at RMIT. And it's always wonderful to be back in the capital. It's a one of its kind theatre and a central landmark of Melbourne. It was designed by Waterburley Griffin and Marion Marnie Griffin in 1924, the legendary architects who also happened to design Canberra's master plan. And I have to mention that they were both RMIT alumnus, and so we know that they were expertly trained with all of their architectural and design skills. So this theatre has been remarked as the best theatre ever to be built and likely to be built, and it's known for the distinctive 3D plaster modules all over the ceiling. It's attempting to elicit a feeling of being in a crystalline cave. And the early patrons to the theatre came to watch silent movies, and they were accompanied by a full orchestra and Australia's first Wurlitzer organ. Later, patrons came to watch movies like Towering Inferno. And if you can imagine back to that time, the ceiling and the walls would flash red at just to those dramatic moments during the film. And in the original day, the ceiling would open up, depending on Melbourne weather, of course, so all of the smoke from pipes and cigarettes could escape the theatre and go into the atmosphere. So now RMIT has revitalised, restored the theatre and for all new audiences, and we reopened it in 2019. So today reflects an important and ongoing conversation that RMIT is very pleased to be part of, because we consider ourselves to be a university in and of the region. And at a time of so much change, rapidly accelerated by the pandemic and associated shifts in trade dynamics, we really do need to have these conversations. So it's now my pleasure to introduce RMIT's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Alec Cameron. He's been with us for nearly a year now, having returned to Australia just in time to miss all of our lockdowns here in Melbourne, following 6 years leading Aston University. And before that, he had a variety of roles across the sector at the University of New South Wales, the University of Western Australia, as well as the corporate role. He's a graduate of the University of Sydney in science and electrical engineering, and a most humble Rhodes Scholar with a doctorate of philosophy from Oxford in robotics. Please welcome Alec Cameron.
Julie, thank you for your introduction and also for your acknowledgement of country. Welcome, the Honourable Don Farrell, Minister for Trade and Tourism, Senator the Honourable Tim Ayres, Assistant Minister for Trade, the Honourable Dr. Craig Emerson, Director of the Australian APEC Study Centre, distinguished guests all, colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to RMIT and to the annual Australian APEC Study Centre lecture. I may be biased, but I can think of no better place to hold this lecture because at RMIT it's in our DNA to use our resources, our talent and our partnerships to make a positive contribution in the communities that we serve. And it's timely because we've just launched our new strategy, which is called Knowledge with Action, that carries this express purpose. And particular of note within our new strategy is that there is a greater focus on our region, the Asia Pacific and specifically Southeast Asia than ever before, which is exactly what brings us here today. With this goal in mind, RMIT will proactively partner to create positive outcomes and address shared challenges and opportunities in the region. With Vietnam operating as the hub of our Asia Pacific network, we will work with industry and government to create collaborative networks across the region focused on inclusive trade, women's economic empowerment, smart and sustainable cities, regional stability and collaboration. And our starting position is strong because RMIT is already thriving and deeply engaged in the region. Our reach extends beyond our substantial campuses in Melbourne and Vietnam, with programs taught in many APEC countries, including Singapore, China, and Hong Kong. So you can see that we're serious about using our diverse assets to create positive impact and contribute to national priorities in the economies where we operate. We house the Australian APEC Study Centre here in Melbourne, which is a valuable part of RMIT's Asia Impact because it provides research expertise in trade and investment across the Asia Pacific region. We host Australia's peak association for international education, the International Education Association of Australia. We are a founder of the Australia-Vietnam Policy Institute, working to further strengthen the bilateral relationship between Australia and Vietnam. And we have partnered with the Asia Society Australia in establishing the Asia Trade and Innovation Hub, a physical and digital gateway to Asia right here in the heart of Melbourne. In combination, we are already very much engaged in APEC's vision of building a dynamic and harmonious regional community. According to Professor Peter Drysdale, a key architect of APEC, few of Australia's achievements in building economic ties with Southeast Asia since the 1960s would have been possible without the connection to regional scholars and practitioners built through higher education. Because higher education institutions have an indispensable role to play in meeting APEC objectives. Operating collaboratively across our economies of origin is clearly pivotal to this, but increasingly so is our ability to provide transnational education without borders. RMIT is an applied university, as we have always been, and our footprint and relationships across the region make us an ideal doorway for engagement, collaboration, and understanding. It's natural then, and in our shared economic, social, and environmental interests, that we play an active role in fostering networks and pathways that increase trade and investment. Now, while I could continue, my real task is to introduce our guest speaker. I don't believe Senator Farrell needs a great deal of preamble, so instead I'd like to call out the way in which he has invested himself so fully and so rapidly into the challenges and opportunities of our region at a critical juncture. And I've no doubt that these ways that he's operating are deeply informed by his previous portfolios, ranging from science and research to tourism as sport, as well as diplomatic experience across the region. As we look forward towards the 50th anniversary of bilateral relations between Australia and Vietnam next year, I can see we are in very good hands. And on behalf of RMIT, we look very much forward to working together for the benefit of the region, its communities, and our future. I'd now like to introduce the Minister, the Honourable Don Farrell.
always have to adjust the microphones. I tend to be the shortest person in the room, so it has to be adjusted downwards. Thank you, Alec, for that very kind introduction and invitation to come to this magnificent theatre designed by Walter Burley Griffin, as I understand it. So thank you very much, and it's always wonderful to be in Melbourne because the weather's always so nice here. You're never disappointed. In fairness, it is coming across from South Australia, so it's not entirely Melbourne's fault. Just like to welcome my fellow Minister, Minister Tim Ayres. He's doing a wonderful job assisting me. It's a big area. Alec talked about the fact that we'd hit the ground running. Well, one of the reasons is I've got a terrific assistant minister helping me out there, and of course he's just pulled off another wonderful negotiation with the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement over the weekend, which is another wonderful sign of progress that this government wants to achieve. And also my very good friend Craig Emerson. Whenever I don't know the answer to a question, I ring Craig and say, "What's the answer to this one?" And he instantly gives me the answer. So thank you for coming along today, Craig, and your wonderful role in this organisation. And also welcome all of the diplomatic corps. I know a lot of you have flown down from Canberra today for the event and yesterday. So thank you very much for coming along to be with us here today. I, of course, begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that are here today. And thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm very honoured to be speaking to the best minds in Australian trade that we have available to us. And I'd particularly like to thank the RMIT and the Australian APEC Study Centre for organising today's events. And as we approach APEC Leaders Summit in Bangkok, and it is quite propitious that we're meeting here while the Prime Minister is currently in Southeast Asia. And that, of course, is that summit on the 18th and 19th of November, which will coincide, interestingly enough, with the report of the Treaties Committee into the India and UK free trade agreements that, all being well, we'll be processing through the Parliament next week, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that later in the speech. But it's a timely reminder of the critical role that APEC has played in fostering economic integration and practical collaboration across our region for more than 3 decades. The Australian APEC Study Centre has made a significant contribution to this effort, particularly through its capacity building initiatives and its expert analysis and advice. We're meeting today at a very challenging time for international trade, and more particularly for the Australian economy. High inflation, rising interest rates, falling real wages, and a legacy record of debt are making life harder and less affordable for many Australians. Chronic skills shortages are making it difficult for businesses to operate and compete at full capacity and profitability. Global supply chains continue to experience major disruption, initially caused by COVID containment policies, but now exacerbated by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. The effects of climate change are being felt around the world, but particularly in our region. That's why we are bidding jointly with our Pacific partners to host a UN climate change conference of the parties in 2026. The vast investment needed to fund the transition to low carbon, low cost and reliable energy generation, storage and transmission is a significant challenge, but also creates real employment, commercial and partnership opportunities in Australia and in our region. After decades of progress building a multilateral trading system underpinned by common rules of the road, a turn away from trade liberalisation has emerged in some parts of the world in recent years. And great power rivalry is undermining many elements of the international rules-based order upon which all nations, whatever their size, depends on for peace, stability and prosperity. It's no longer possible, even if it ever was, to insulate our trade policy from geopolitics. Attempts to apply economic pressure, including targeting of Australian goods in recent years, has demonstrated the risks to our economy when the rules of the road are ignored. Australia's future prosperity will in part depend on how well we can adapt to the challenging strategic circumstances which we now face. And likewise, our ability to navigate those strategic challenges will in part be shaped by the extent of our economic power and influence. Increasingly, economic policy and national security policy are intertwined. A resilient Australian economy underpins national security. Australia is economically stronger when global trade flows freely. More trade, not less, is a key part of how we build an economic future we want in Australia, with secure, high-paying jobs and an open, internationally competitive economy powered by clean energy. But how we trade, who we trade with, and what we trade needs to reflect our current strategic moment and the challenges we face. Today, I will outline the government's vision for trade and make the case for why trade is a force for good in addressing our current and future challenges. There are four principles underpinning our approach. The first principle is that to meet the challenge of our time, we need to deepen and, more importantly, diversify our trading relationships, particularly in our own region. As we've discovered, over-reliance on any single trading partner comes with significant risks. That's why trade diversification is a central plank of the government's trade policy strategy. That's not to say we can neglect our economic and trade relations with China. China remains our largest trading partner, accounting for more exports than Japan, the United States, and the Republic of Korea combined. But trade blockages imposed by China have reinforced the importance of businesses taking a considered approach to minimising risk exposure. We want to see China trade measures impending a wide range of Australian exports remove, including the duties on barley and wine that Australia is challenging through the World Trade Organisation dispute settlement system. As with any WTO dispute, we're open to discussing possible off-ramps that result in a mutually agreed solution that is in Australia's interests. As we seek to stabilise the relationship with China, Australia will continue to work with our partners to build a region that is stable, prosperous, and where national sovereignty is respected. Australia has long been a driver of regional economic integration and a champion of regional institutions. It was a recognition of the Hawke-Keating era that Australia's security and economic future resided in Asia that led us to establish APEC in the first place. And it's the same recognition driving us now to deepening our economic ties across the Indo-Pacific. Joining the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework was one of the first acts of the new Albanese government. IPEF, as it's known, is focused on delivering concrete solutions that address contemporary challenges like decarbonisation, digital trade, and supply chain resilience. It seeks to lower the types of trade barriers you won't find in a tariff line and to elevate labour and environmental standards across the region, ensuring that trade is both free and fair. Last month, I signed the landmark Australia-Singapore Green Economy Agreement, which establishes a new framework for strengthening economic collaboration in green growth sectors and harnessing the opportunities of the global energy transition. And over the weekend, we substantially concluded negotiations to upgrade the ASEAN Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which will open up new opportunities for Australian services exporters and investors and bind us closer to the region. Our Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040, led by the Special Envoy to Southeast Asia, Nicholas Moore, will map out further export and investment opportunities, matching Australian capabilities across key sectors in the region. Deepening our trade with India, and welcome the High Commissioner here today, the world's fastest growing large economy, is a high priority, including through the India Economic Strategy. As I said earlier, we hope to ratify the India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement this year and are powering ahead on negotiations on an ambitious, comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. We're also working to implement our trade agreement with the United Kingdom. In addition to removing tariffs and facilitating service trade and investment, the agreement includes innovative elements such as a commitment to implement reciprocal arrangements to provide for royalties to be paid to Australian artists, including Indigenous artists, where their artworks are sold in the United Kingdom. Looking further afield, the Australian-European Free Trade Agreement is potentially a game changer, providing enhanced access to a high-income market of almost 450 million people with a combined GDP of 23 trillion Australian dollars. The geostrategic and economic case for concluding a trade agreement with the European Union has strengthened. A trade deal can build on our mutually beneficial economic ties. For example, in renewable energy and critical minerals, where Australia can be a safe, reliable supplier. But there are other important commercial interests at stake, and any deal we strike will put these interests front and centre, including delivering substantial new market access for our key agricultural products. We're also partnering with other countries to combat non-tariff barriers that make it harder for exporters to trade. I've tasked my department to lead and coordinate efforts with Australian stakeholders to address existing and emerging non-tariff barriers to trade. The ministerial-led Technical Barriers to Trade Working Group will have oversight of this important work. We're also making it easier for our businesses to trade globally by streamlining trade processes through the simplified trade system. These reforms will enhance the international competitiveness of the Australian economy. All of these elements combined will help us diversify our network of trading partners and create new opportunities for Australian exporters and investors. It's work we need to undertake to protect Australia's economic future and support an Indo-Pacific region that is peaceful, stable, and most importantly, prosperous. While we are investing heavily in our region, we continue to invest in the multilateral trading system. Representing Australia at the successful 12th World Trade Organisation Ministerial Conference was one of the first things I did as Trade Minister. The WTO system is fundamental to Australia's prosperity and security and has underpinned economic progress and stability in the Indo-Pacific. That's why our second principle is that we must work not just to defend the multilateral system, but to reform it so that it delivers for Australia, for the region, and for the broader world. Of course, 4 decades of increasing openness to international trade and investment in Australia, underpinned by WTO rules, have materially increased Australian living standards. But reform is needed to reinvigorate the negotiating function of the WTO and update the rules of the road to better respond to contemporary challenges. The packages of outcome at the 12th Ministerial Conference, including an agreement to end harmful fisheries subsidies, achieved by working closely with our Pacific Island partners, and agreed steps towards WTO reform, showed that progress is still possible. Australia is not an 800-pound gorilla, which means we cannot risk a return to the law of the jungle should the WTO be allowed to wither. So we're investing in reform of the multilateral trading system, including its dispute settlement system, and we are investing in the region. But we also need to invest in ourselves. That means diversifying not just who we trade with, but what we trade and how we trade. That means using effective industry policy to ensure our services and product offerings to the world is more diverse, of higher value, and more sophisticated. That also means using all possible trade channels for our exporters to grow and diversify, including digital channels. And the digital economy is expected to continue to grow at an accelerated rate. And this is our third principle. At the macro level, trade creates jobs, and jobs in export industries tend to pay higher wages. Recent analysis shows that 1 in 4 Australian jobs is related to trade, and jobs in export industries pay 5% above the national average income. Trade also plays a significant role in delivering cheaper goods and services and more competition, easing cost of living pressures for Australian families, while reducing input and running costs for businesses, making them more competitive further down the supply value chain. For example, a trade deal with the European Union that eliminates the 5% import tariffs on motor vehicles could result in savings of up to $2,000 for an Australian family purchasing a VW Golf. A plumber could save $2,600 on a VW transporter van. Open trade is a net positive for our society. But there are winners and losers in international trade. Australia's manufacturing sector has declined rapidly, now accounting for less than 7% of our GDP. That's bad for jobs in our region and in our suburbs. It's also bad for national resilience, for our capacity to solve national problems and engage in global supply chains. That's why open trade must also be paired with good economic, industry, and social policy. We need to be a nation that innovates and creates new employment opportunities, delivering economic growth across Australia, including to our outer suburbs and our regions. We know that when given the chance to compete on a level playing field, Australian businesses thrive. That's why we're investing in the Australian manufacturing, Australian innovation, and Australian skills. Building industry capacity is a complex, modern world of global trade, is about much more than just relying on our natural endowments. It's something that must be built deliberately and strategically as a genuine partnership between industry, government, investors, and our scientists, engineers, and research institutions. The National Reconstruction Fund will help expand Australia's industrial base, diversify the economy, and create sustainable, high-paying jobs. Will help drive investment in clean energy manufacturing, medical manufacturing, new technologies, agriculture, and critical minerals. The fund will give us a competitive edge in global trade, propelling us further up the value chain while continuing to meet our international obligations. Foreign investment will also play a critical role in lifting us up, bringing in new capital, capability, and resources. Companies across the globe are leading investment in Australia's solar, wind, hydrogen, and critical mineral industries. The World Expo in 2025 in Osaka will provide an opportunity to showcase our clean energy and low emissions technologies on a global stage and entice even greater investment in Australia's renewable energy sector. All of these measures will help us create a future made in Australia and position us globally to seize the substantial opportunities of the transition to net zero. And that brings us to my fourth and final principle of our approach. We believe strongly that the benefits of trade must be shared amongst the community. Trade must be a driver of inclusive economic growth and greater economic well-being for all Australians. It must deliver for the Australian people. At the heart of the government's economic policy is a fundamental belief that fairness and equality should be our guiding stars, and trade is no different. Sharing the benefits starts with how we involve the community in trade policy process, and a recognition that a diversity of voices is needed. The Trade 2040 Task Force will bring together government, industry, unions, and community representatives and serve as the main consultation forum to progress the government's trade policy agenda. The task force will ensure that traditional marginalised voices are amplified, including those of First Nations Australian and women. The government will soon announce the appointment of an ambassador for First Nations people who will have responsibility for ensuring Indigenous perspectives, experiences and interests are reflected in the government's foreign and trade policy positions. Ensuring the benefits of the trade flow to the Australian community also means we maintain Australia's right to regulate key social policy areas like health, the environment and issues affecting First Nations Australians in all of our trade agreements. It means giving a fair go to Australian workers by including rules in trade agreements that commit to maintaining high labour standards. It means investing in the skills, training and development of Australian workers in our regions and in our suburbs. It means helping small and medium businesses take advantage of the opportunities that come with open trade. And it means preserving the government's ability to govern in the national interests. To that end, we will not include investor-state dispute settlements in any new trade agreements. And when opportunities arise, we will actively engage in processes of reforming existing ISDS mechanism to enhance transparency, consistency, and ensure adequate scope to allow the government to regulate in the public interest. Ladies and gentlemen, we're the government of a free, fair and open trade. We believe deepening and diversifying our trading relationships will make us more resilient. We believe defending and reforming the rules-based multilateral trading system is vital for Australia's security and prosperity and that of our region. We believe in a diversified economy that harnesses Australians' ingenuity and that will make us stronger. And we believe that the enormous benefits of open trade should be accrued ultimately to the Australian community. We look forward to partnering with you in this whole-of-nation effort. Thank you very much.
I'm relying heavily on technology. I'm mic'd up. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic, lovely. Well, thank you. Wow. Time is up, 4 minutes and 19 seconds. Oh, we're back to 30 minutes. That's a relief. We're going to have to do some speed Q&A. Well, thank you, Minister. Thank you, Don, for your speech. And what I will do after a couple of opening questions is look to the audience. This is not pre-arranged, choreographed at all. So anything could happen here.
And probably will.
And probably will. So my first question is a bit personal in this sense. As an Australian Trade Minister, have you formed any views in your interactions with other trade ministers around the world about the weight that Australia carries in international discussions? Are we one of 160 odd WTO members, or are we regarded as something a little bit more important than that?
Look, thanks for that question, Craig. I perhaps should preface my comments about interaction with other trade ministers that what's tended to happen is that I meet a trade minister, we get on like a house on fire, we make great plans for the future, and within a week or so they've been removed from the job and replaced by somebody else. So far that started happening in Indonesia. Within a week of meeting the Indonesian Trade Minister, he was gone. I invited the the UK Trade Minister to come and visit my vineyard in the Clare Valley. Within a week, she was gone.
Are you finding that your counterparts are now reluctant to meet you?
No. That hasn't happened so far yet, Craig. But look, the interesting thing, I think, is Australia is very well respected in the international community. If we just look at the European one, same thing happened with the French Trade Minister. I met him. A week later, there was a replacement. But I am going to the new Trade Minister's vineyard in Strasbourg in a couple of weeks' time. And I hope he's still there. But let's take the EU agreement. We started negotiations with the EU way before the New Zealanders. We had obviously some problems. There was some concern amongst the Europeans about our approach to climate change. And of course we had the problem with the decision to not proceed with the Naval submarine project and move to the United States and UK. Now that both of those issues are out of the way and we've resolved the submarine issue, there's almost an audible sigh of relief amongst the Europeans about our new policies in respect of climate change. It still meant that New Zealand got an agreement ahead of us, but it does mean, I think, that hopefully in the first half of next year we can nail an agreement with the Europeans. So, you know, these countries like us. We've got a very good reputation as being a reliable trading partner. I think that stands us in very good stead in terms of these future agreements. Obviously the EU one is going to be important. The IPEF, bringing the United States back into our region, is going to be very important. And of course, getting the final touches to the India Free Trade Agreement. They're all going to be very important items over the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, thanks very much for those insights and hopefully not prophecies about your counterparts. My second question before we go to invite others relates to APEC. And when I reflect now on back in 1989 as trade advisor to Bob Hawke, APEC seemed like a good idea at the time, and it turned out not being very difficult. It started with Australia and Korea, and then 21 economies joined fairly quickly, and Paul Keating reminds us that he made it into a leaders' meeting with Bill Clinton in, I think, 1993. But given the complexities of where we are now, with protectionism, including in the United States, but certainly not limited to that, could you envisage in the modern era, like today, the creation of an APEC, which includes Russia, China, the United States, and a whole lot of diverse economies. It seems to me that the sentiment towards, or the consensus that was being built towards free trade now is, perhaps stalled, but hopefully can be restarted.
Well, if I look back to that period, the late 1980s, of course, you were a much younger man then.
You were too.
You were working for Bob Hawke
Yep.
as an economic advisor, and my first attempt to get into politics was 1988. Was the so-called Adelaide by-election, sometimes known as the time telephone election. I was the candidate for the seat of Adelaide in South Australia after the Finance Minister, Chris Herford, had resigned and gone to New York. And things were looking really well to replace him in that election until Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister, announced that we were going to introduce time telephone calls. Now, we all expect our calls to be timed now because we're all on mobile phones, but back then it was pretty unpopular, and as a result, I lost the seat. But thankfully, you came and helped me campaign, so it was very good of you to do so. Could we achieve it today, I think is your question. Things are sort of tightening up, and I guess in some sense you can understand why that is. Particularly post the pandemic, lots of economies are really struggling. And I guess it's easy for some of our trading partners to say, look, let's move to a protectionist environment, and that'll solve some of our problems. But as we know, protectionism doesn't solve your problems. If it does anything, it makes them worse, it exacerbates them. So I think our job is to try and lead the way into a free and fair trading environment. The good thing about our discussions right now with the United States is that there does seem to be an opportunity to bring the United States back into our region through the IPEF agreement. When I was in Japan a couple of weeks ago, the Japanese still hold out hope that the agreement, previously known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, could include the United States, that they might be able to convince the United States to come back into that agreement. Unfortunately, I think the political environment, both in terms of Democrat and Republicans, is very much hostile to that particular agreement. So in order to get the Americans back into our region, but more particularly engaging in international trade, IPEF represents an opportunity to do that. And so I think what we need to do is particularly encourage the Americans to show a leadership role in this regard, to turn outwards rather than inwards, and use that agreement as an opportunity to expand trading operation and lead the way back. I mean, we are used to the Americans leading the way. They very much turned inwards under President Trump. We've got to convince and encourage them to look outwardly, look openly, and simple things like re-engaging with the World Trade Organization, trying to push for reform that opens up world trade rather than closes it down.
Just a very, very brief trip down memory lane. In 1988, on the last day when Bob Hawke finally said at 5 p.m, I will not rule out timed local telephone calls, we had a formula with him over 2 days where he had a perfectly acceptable answer, but he was very tired and cranky, and he said that, and that was the end of your prospects in the seat of Adelaide. We're on a plane the next day to Launceston, and Bob, still tired, said, "And I can say to Mr. Whitney, you will not be there for long, my friend, you will not be there for long." And Barry Cassidy and I looked at each other and thought, who's Mr. Whitney? But I'd learned at this stage not to act surprised in front of the gathered media. So the doorstop interview finished and we said to Bob, "Who's Mr. Whitney?" And he said, "What's the name of the bloke who won the seat?" We said, "Pratt." He said, Pratt and Whitney. And he was looking out, he'd been looking out the side of the plane to the Pratt and Whitney engines on the plane. So, yeah, they weren't his finest moments, but fortunately none of the journalists knew who the successful candidate was either, and so we got through that one. But it is time to make a formal apology, and I'm very sorry about that, Don. Interestingly, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, part of your speech today is very poignant about that because the Americans were very keen for Australia to join it, and which we did at the negotiations, and press it home with other countries. But the sticking point is that America was insisting on investor-state dispute settlement. And we had a policy back then in 2011, 2012 to resist ISDS, so very pleased that you've ruled that out under this government going forward. We should use established international forums to settle these sorts of disputes, not create a new one with panellists from wherever.
Look, I think the truth is that neither the IPEF agreement or the EU free trade agreement will include provisions like that, either at our request or their request.
That's great. Yeah.
It's a fair assessment.
So your time now. Any questions? It's actually a bit difficult to see from here. Maybe if you stand, it'll also help with the microphones, and don't feel shy about standing up so we can see you.
Good afternoon, Minister Farrell. Thank you for your speech. My name is Maria. I'm the Philippine Consulate General. I'm the Philippine Consul General. My question is, well, we know that protectionism has many faces. It's not just about tariffs. And my question is, what are Australia's priorities and expectations of the recent ASEAN Free Trade Agreement? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I was married in the Philippines 39 years ago, and Ferdinand Marcos was the president of the Philippines. And next year, when my wife and I go back to celebrate 40 years of marriage, President Marcos will also be the president of the Philippines. So I think it might be said that the more things change in the Philippines, the more they stay the same. But with our new agreement that Minister Ayres so successfully was engaged in over the weekend, I think we're looking forward, not looking back. ASEAN represents really the greatest opportunity to diversify our trading relationship. You've got a huge population, a growing population. Just to give an example, when I was married in the Philippines 39 years ago, the Philippines had a population of 60 million. I think today the figures double that now, closer to 120 million. The Philippine economy is growing by 6 or 7% a year, faster than most other countries in the region. And of course, you've got a young, predominantly English-speaking, well-educated workforce. You can look at a whole range of countries in the Asia-Pacific where living standards are rising. You've got an increasing middle class, and I think it represents wonderful opportunities. One of the things that the new agreement will do, of course, is give us greater opportunities in the digital space, and I think that's an aspect of that agreement which I think holds great opportunities for us. That's going to be a part of the IPEF agreement, and of course the Philippines and many other ASEAN countries are going to be part of IPEF. But I think that's perhaps of all of the things that have changed as a result of that new agreement, that's going to give us the greatest opportunities.
Excellent. We have a question at the middle. We'll take this one just because the mic's near, and then to you.
Thank you. Anna Malos from Climate Works Centre, part of Monash University. I was very interested in your principles around making the trade agreements more, coherent with a broader agenda. And one of the things we've recognised is that the economic framework probably works better where sort of the sort of level of economic development and innovation are more broadly similar to Australia. So we were interested in how capacity building and technical assistance is going to support that economic cooperation, particularly in terms of getting that transition to a net zero economy that we need to limit climate change. Just interested what work you might be doing in that area.
Yeah, thank you for that. Look, I think this is the greatest challenge that we face as a country and as a world. The Labor Party has got a very ambitious project to get to 43% by 2030 and then net zero emissions by 2050. It's very easy to say that, rolls off the tongue very, very easily. But it's much harder to actually implement, that statement. I've just come back from Japan and Korea. There hadn't been much interaction over the period of the pandemic, so there was a lot of catching up to do, but it didn't matter where I went in either of those countries. The message was pretty much the same, that we're on board for decarbonisation, but do you understand what the problems are in that process? And of course, one potential problem is that we move too quickly out of conventional sources of power, and we don't pick up the new technologies quick enough. Now, Prime Minister Albanese has said he wants Australia to be a superpower in renewable energy. Everyone's talking about that. There's lots of commitments by particularly our Asian neighbours to develop all of the things we're going to need to decarbonise the economy. But if we're honest about it, we're not quite there yet. Some of these technologies that will replace the conventional methods of energy are not there. Just to give you one example, if you sit up in Darwin and you watch INPEX sending out some of the gas to Japan, in order to liquefy that gas, you've got to get down to minus roughly 150 degrees. If you're going to replace that gas with hydrogen to get to net zeros, you've then got to get that hydrogen down to minus 250 degrees, so 100 degrees cooler. And strangely enough, hydrogen molecules are much smaller than gas molecules. So in order to pump them along, for instance, pipelines, you're actually going to have to build new pipelines. The current set of pipelines won't effectively transmit hydrogen. So there's a lot of work to be done. What are we doing to assist that? Well, the export finance organisations of Australia are trying to invest in the renewable energies of the future. That means hydrogen, that means critical minerals. One of the interesting things when I was in the United States a couple of weeks ago was the passing of what they called the Inflation Reduction Act. It was a piece of legislation which very much prioritises Australian critical minerals. If you want to get the benefit of a tax refund on an electric car in the United States, the critical minerals have to come from a country with a free trade agreement with the United States. That's Australia. So this gives us a wonderful opportunity, but we're going to have some investment. That means investment from overseas to extract critical minerals. The interesting thing about critical minerals is if you're mining iron ore, you can see an iron ore mine for as far as the eye can see, but critical minerals are quite different. They tend to be in much smaller deposits. They're much further underground, and of course the deposits won't last as long because they tend to be much smaller than, say, an iron ore deposit. So you're going to have more investment to extract those critical minerals, and then you're going to have more exploration in order to ensure that they get developed. So we're committing the funds to try and help develop. Part of all of these new agreements that we're trying to negotiate at the moment seeks investment from overseas, because typically we've never been able to have all of the investment money for these developments to come from Australia. So we're going to need investment from overseas, and we're organising all of those things to try and get the best result so that by 2030 we can be well down the track of becoming a renewable energy superpower.
Excellent. There we go, already arranged, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Minister Farrell. My name is Dr. Prue Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. Recently, the US announced a ban on the export of semiconductors and manufacturing equipment for making semiconductors to China. I was just wondering, I just appreciate your view, if you could comment on that decision, and also whether you would ever envisage Australia similarly having to restrict exports to achieve national security objectives.
Well, that's a very good question. I think you're referring to the CHIPS Act. One of the things I think that we've learnt over the last 10 years is that when you put all of your eggs in the one basket, so that you have one major trading partner, if problems arise with that trading partner, as they've done between our relationship with China over things like wheat, barley, meat, crayfish, for instance, of all things crayfish, you find yourselves in a very sort of difficult situation. So I think the Americans have acted out of concern for that sort of issue. They don't want to find themselves in a situation where they're reliant on a trading partner who ultimately turns out to be unreliable. Will we go down the same path? Well, we don't have plans to do that at the moment. In fact, we're hoping that discussions between our Prime Minister and the President of China results in some freeing up of current trading blockages. So our first strategy, I suppose you'd call it, is trying to sort of stabilise our relationship with our trading nations, treat them respectfully, but at all times ensuring that we prosecute the case for our national security and national interests, and also progress those sorts of issues that we've always relied upon, like human rights. So it's a delicate balance. We're very lucky in having Foreign Minister Penny Wong in charge of our foreign policy, because I think her cool and calm approach will help us avoid some of these problems, so that maybe we don't have to go to the more draconian actions that the United States have gone down.
We have time for one more question near the front. 1, 2, 3. Third row back. Yep.
Thanks. I'm Patricia Ranald. I'm convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, and we're particularly concerned about lifting labour and environmental standards through trade agreements. I just wanted to take up a point about the ASEAN agreement that you referred to. My understanding is that this is a revision of the existing Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, and I wanted to take up a point that was raised earlier. Does that revised agreement have the aim of lifting labour standards? In other words, does it have chapters which talk about labour rights and environmental standards? And will there be a program from Australia and New Zealand to assist the other countries, the ASEAN countries, to meet those goals?
Thanks for that question. As you correctly say, the ASEAN agreement is a renewal of a current agreement, and my comments in terms of for instance, the investor-state dispute situations relate to new agreements. Where I think we have the best opportunity of dealing with the two particular issues that you've raised is through the IPEF agreement. The United States has had a very, very difficult time in supporting free trade agreements post the 2016 election. President Trump made it almost impossible for the United States to negotiate free trade agreements because he demonised them in the process. And even though what we called the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a concept of President Obama, by the end of that 2016 election, even the Democrats weren't prepared to endorse free trade agreements. Now, IPEF is the first sign that the United States is re-engaging economically and looking outwards rather than inwards. I see that agreement, it's being negotiated by two key Americans, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, and Ambassador Catherine Tai. Catherine Tai wants to see this agreement as a worker-centric agreement. In other words, that the benefits of any of these agreements don't just go to businesses, but workers get a benefit out of any free trade agreement. And I see the IPEF as perhaps being the best vehicle for progressing the sorts of issues that you're talking about into the future.
Well, it's time for me to exit stage left, and I would like to invite Julie Kogan to close proceedings. Thank you. Thanks very much, Don.
Thanks for your support.
Thank you so much, Senator Farrell, for your insights, and Craig for leading such an engaging conversation. And it certainly seems that there are a lot of important issues on the agenda over the next 6 to 12 months, but reassuring to know that Australia is seen to be a reliable and respected partner in the international trade community. So I'd love to invite you all now to continue the conversation, and we'll be serving refreshments in the foyer. Thank you. It's interesting, I was in the Philippines when the Koreakino and Marcos government, you couldn't wear red or yellow at those days, and interesting times.
So I met Korea Kino's son, who became president